Hi there, I'm Dr. Rachel Moss. Welcome to my medieval kitchen. As well as being a lecturer in history at the University of Northampton, I'm also an enthusiastic home cook, and today I thought I'd bring together those interests by giving you a recipe for medieval cookies of happiness, something we could all do with in these troubled times. This recipe originates with a woman called Hildegard von Bingen. You might not have heard of this German nun, and that would be a real shame because she's actually one of the most brilliant women to have ever lived. In fact, in 2012, Pope Benedict XVI named her a Doctor of the Church. That's a saint who has been considered to have extraordinary influence on church doctrine or theology, and that's because of the originality of her thinking. Now, Hildegard, who was born in around 1098 and entered a convent in childhood, was what we term a polymath. She had extraordinary far-ranging expertise in a whole range of subjects, in theology, in music, in medicine, in science. She was an extraordinary composer. Many of her compositions survive today. She had a huge influence on the development of medieval science. But today we're interested in her medical expertise because, yes, these cookies are considered to be a natural remedy. What could be better than a prescription that includes biscuits? Hildegard's first great scientific work, Physica, details the scientific and medical properties of various plants, stones, fish, reptiles, animals, and under the entry for nutmeg is the following recipe. I'm going to read this out loud to you. Sorry if I end up glancing away from the camera. Nutmeg has great heat and good moderation in its powers. If a person eats nutmeg, it will open up his heart, make his judgment free from obstruction, and give him a good disposition. Take some nutmeg and an equal weight of cinnamon and a bit of cloves and pulverize them. Then make small cakes with this and fine whole wheat flour and water. Eat them often. It will calm all bitterness of the heart and mind, open your heart and impaired senses, and make your mind cheerful. It purifies your senses and diminishes all harmful humours in you. It gives good liquid to your blood and it makes you strong. Now, I definitely want to get in on that. Those all sound very wholesome things to do, and also it sounds like something delicious to eat. It sounds like a very highly spiced cracker to me because there is no fat or sugar in the recipe. That makes sense for a recipe coming from a nun, and also something that's intended as a health remedy, not as a treat. You might be surprised by the quantity of spices. There's a kind of popular reputation that medieval food was bland or uninteresting, but in fact medieval food was highly spiced when people could afford it, and it was really quite innovative. It's also not true that people use spices to hide the rotten flavour of food. Medieval people did not eat food that had gone bad, and they did not use spices to hide decay because that certainly doesn't stop food poisoning, and medieval people were not stupid. They put lots of spices in their food because they really liked spices. However, spices like this would have been very expensive, so this is quite a luxurious recipe. And so it's something that is intended to really fix a spiritual malaise and some general health problems. So I think it's definitely worth a shot. But I'm going to make two versions of this recipe today. I'm going to make one that's as close as possible to Hildegard's recipe, and then I'm going to make one that's maybe a little bit more palatable for modern tastes. It's going to have some sugar and butter in it, and that's partly because I have a 5-year-old and I really don't think I want to inflict spiced, unsugared crackers, which I think the first type are going to turn out on her. But you never know, maybe we'll all be surprised by how medieval the flavours appeal to the modern palate. Let's find out together. For this recipe, I've decided to use spelt flour because that's probably what Hildegard used. Spelt is an ancient grain, but you can now buy it from health food shops because it's packed with protein and fibre, much more than regular wheat flour. It has a slightly nutty taste and a lower gluten content than regular wheat flour. That means it can be easier to digest, but it's also more prone to crumbling, so this isn't the flour to use to make robust sugar cookie style cut-out cookies. We've got our spices here. You see nutmeg, cloves and cinnamon. Now, Hildegard's recipe, you'll have noticed, does not give any quantities. That's quite typical for medieval recipes. So you probably have to use a little bit of imagination and common sense, and also some baking know-how. Now, we know that medieval people like their foods highly spiced. So I've used a couple of teaspoons of the cinnamon and the nutmeg, and there's a little bit of cloves, and I've prepared this here. And then I'm going to use, for the regular cookies, a typical kind of modern baking ratio of using 3 portions of flour to 2 portions of fat. So you've got some butter over here, to 1 portion of sugar, which will make them sweet, but not too sweet. But for Hildegard's recipe, I'm going to carry out quite strictly and just use the water, spices and flour and see how those turn out. Let's have a go. So in here I've got some spelt flour and all the spices, and I'm going to make the traditional cracker first. So I'm just adding a little bit of water at a time. This is going to be quite sticky, and I don't want it to get too wet. I'll bring that all together. It smells really nice, that lovely warm smell of spices, but it does not smell sweet. So I'm getting something now which looks a little bit like breadcrumbs. So I think I'll need just a tiny bit more water, and then I'm going to be able to bring it together and flatten it out so I can make it into little cookies. This is not going to be like the traditional biscuit dough at all. I'll show it to you. So I rolled out and cut out the mixture using a small pastry cutter, and 1/2 cup of flour has made 9 little biscuits, which I think is good enough for a test. So I'm going to put them in the oven now at 160 degrees fan. That's a good standard temperature to try this on. So you probably want to bump that up to 170 or 180 if you don't have a fan oven. And I think they'll only need a few minutes in there. So let's try it out and turn to making the more modern version of these cookies. Okay, so let's try and make our modern cookies. So we've got some spelt flour in here, and it's already got the spices in. And I'm doing the proportions 3 to 2 to 1. So just, use as much flour as you want, and then have 2/3 of that quantity of fat and 1/3 of that of sugar. It's kind of a good rule of thumb for making basic cookies. So I'm going to add in my sugar. So I've mixed some brown and white sugar just because I like the combination of flavours, although white and brown sugar do have slightly different properties in cooking. Okay, so stirring that in, and then I'm going to add the fat, and I'm also going to add an egg. So egg really helps bind it. The proteins help bind the dough together and will help it rise more nicely. Adding an egg in definitely makes it more of a medieval treat, especially along with all that butter. This would not have been something that you could have eaten during Lent. Okay, so let's add in our fats. I'm going to try and bring these together, more like breadcrumbs. Now you could do this in a food processor, that's totally fine, but I thought I would at least keep some medieval spirit and use my fingers for this. It smells really lovely. It does actually smell quite Christmassy, so I think this might be something that I end up pulling out during Christmas time. Not that gingery smell perhaps you associate with Christmas, but all that lovely cinnamon goodness. So this is smelling really nice. Maybe if you're missing your pumpkin spice lattes, this could be something that you might like to try. So you get these coming into fine sort of breadcrumb texture. It actually feels quite therapeutic, I think, to be kind of blending the flour into the butter with your fingers. There's nothing high-tech about this. If you're doing it with your hands, there's really nothing you can do to speed it up, and actually sometimes I think that's quite nice. You know, you just have to spend a little moment being a little bit mindful, getting everything coming together into a fine sort of dough. But again, if this really stresses you out, you find it boring, then do use a food presser, just whiz it together gently. You want to be creaming the butter and sugar together. And I thought that I would just pull them all into a bowl and not worry about that too much. Okay, so that's beginning to turn into the sort of sandy texture I would be expecting. Now, I haven't really used spelt flour before, so I'm really interested to see how its properties differ from the kind of regular white flour that I tend to use for baking. So I know the gluten content of this is lower, and I know its protein content is higher. So a lot of people think, oh, that's more nutritious. It could also possibly make baking a little bit more complicated. It may not react in the same kinds of ways. Now I'm going to add an egg to this. It's just going to help bind everything. It'll also help it cook more evenly in the oven. If you're vegan, of course, you can substitute this. This is a recipe that could easily be vegan. You know, that you can use vegan margarine, or perhaps you could use sunflower oil. I mean, that's going to end up in a different texture, but I'm sure it would still be delicious. And of course, instead of an egg, you could be using flax seeds. Now this is beginning to come together into a dough, into quite a sandy kind of dough, but I was really expecting that. So it's smelling really nice. And once I've finished pulling it together, I'm going to roll it into a ball. And then something's really important for cookies, is that you must put it in the fridge. Otherwise, when you cut them out and put them in the oven, they will spread. The fat should not be too warm, and this butter has got quite warmed up from my fingers and from being stirred around. So we need to cool it back down again, and then we will roll it out and cut them into shapes and pop them in the oven. So Hildegard's recipe for spelt cookies have come out of the oven. What do we think they're going to taste like? They certainly look quite wholesome, which I know is sometimes code for not very tasty. But let's see. Oh, that definitely does taste like a health food. It's certainly not unpleasant. There's kind of a nice light spiciness to it. It tastes a little bit like kind of a dense bread, actually, rather than a cracker, which is what I was expecting. Perhaps if I baked a bit longer, it'd have more of a cracker quality. But you can see it's quite dense. And the flavour of spice is actually not as strong as you might have anticipated. I think that because there wasn't really anything there which would kind of complement the notes, like sugar and salt, the spice actually becomes quite subtle. This actually does taste relatively austere, and I could see how it could be used as a prescription, something that you would take to feel better. Now, eating this certainly doesn't make me feel any more miserable, but let's see what my sugar cookie version of the biscuits turns out to be like. Will that make me smile a little bit more? Let's see. Okay, I've taken the sugary version of the dough out of the fridge, and I've rolled it out and cut it into shapes. Now here's a useful little trick I learned from Smitten Kitchen. Rolling out cold dough is really, really annoying. So roll out your dough between two pieces of parchment before you put it in the fridge. So put it onto a baking tray and then put it in the fridge, and then cut out your shapes. It's so much easier, but the dough will still be nice and cold when it goes into the oven. Okay, so I'm going to put these in again at 160 fan, and I think it'll take only a few minutes. 10 would probably even be pushing it for them to bake, because these are really quite small. I've kept them relatively austere in size because of their convent origins. They're out of the oven, hooray, and they've cooled down. So I gave these 8 minutes in the oven, and they came out quite soft, but as they cooled down, they did harden. So don't be tempted to overbake them. Don't wait until they're hard in the oven, or when you get to eat them, they will taste like hardtack, which is not what you want. So having sampled these, they definitely do have a wholesome kind of health foodie vibe, in the sense that they do taste quite wholemeal, but it's a very pleasant taste. They're not overly sweet, and the spice really comes through. They taste kind of warm and comforting, and I think will be lovely with a cup of tea. So I think that Hildegard von Bingen's recipe for medieval happy biscuits definitely works and is worth a try. Why not give it a go and let me know how you get on?